evening and welcome to the 7 o'clock news here on CNC3. I'm Charlene Ramdani.
Good evening, glad you can join us. I'm Samson Anton.
Good evening, I'm Roger Sant.
In the headlines tonight, a massive show of force against the government as the opposition rallies its forces to President's house and delivers a petition demanding answers from the Prime Minister. The head of government's legislative committee says the legislation the committee brought before Parliament is fundamentally different from what was proclaimed.
A pensioner is killed in a house fire in central Trinidad. Police suspect foul play. The National Security Minister meets Beverly Hills residents about crime. We tell you the outcome later.
And in sport, the WICB has a new CEO. He is Jamaican Michael Murphy.
A crowd police put at over 10,000 this afternoon in a march organised by the People's National Movement in response to the Clause 34 controversy. The Queen's Park Savannah was shut down as the crowd marched from Woodford Square in Port of Spain to deliver a petition bearing over 25,000 signatures to Acting President Timothy Hammersmith, calling for answers on why the Cabinet sought to have Clause 34 proclaimed separate and apart from the entire legislation. Cameraman Vern Singh and Samson Anton covered the march.
To many who felt the opposition PNM would not attract support for its march, this was the answer. Here at Abercrombie Street, around 1:30 in the sweltering heat, they sang lustily, "We shall throw them out," as they marched uptown. They had gathered at Woodford Square for 1 in the afternoon, dressed in red, armed with placards, ready to show their disapproval with the government over the early proclamation of Clause 34 that favoured party financiers, a decision many have deemed deliberate and calculated, and for which the government is yet to give a reason enough to appease those angered by it. A conversation between the police and political leader, Dr. Keith Rowley, and then they were off, stopping first at the Ministry of National Security, where their protest march took on a different twist. With drums, they marched uptown. At Dr. Rowley's side, THA Chief Secretary Orville London, and here to show their support, MSJ leader David Abdullah, Vincent Cabrera, and others. Religious support as well, as some conducted mini ceremonies on the way. As they moved uptown in their volumes, look at the crowd as they walked outside the Bishop Anstey High School, nearing the Savannah. Many having joined along the way. The distance was only swelling the numbers. This took them around the Savannah, where police were not leaving anything to chance as they neared the U.S. Embassy, given the threats that presently exist, but they moved past without a hitch.
It is very rare that the Queen's Park Savannah is shut down at this time of the day or ever. But this is a time when students are going home from school and a lot of people are affected. But the PNM believes that this march, the first march that has been held by the party in a very, very long time, is very, very important to getting their message about the democracy of the country.
A democracy, the PNM says, is under threat, but one they believe is being guarded by the raised voices of the people. But even if by then one had doubts, the sheer size of the crowd was staggering, as by the time the front had reached Queen's Royal College, the back had passed the embassy. As they neared President's house, the acting president, Timothy Hammersmith, arrived under tight security. Here, a heavy police presence as the crowd stood in the rain, chanting and singing. Party officials gathered petitions, 25,000 of them, but when Dr. Rowley and his team tried to enter President's house, it created a security nightmare for the police. The police would form a bubble around them, eventually allowing them free passage without the crowd. Dr. Rowley and his team would emerge about 45 minutes later, telling the audience that he had asked the president for some specific things.
I have asked the president to trace the document backwards to its origin, the document that asked him to sign the proclamation, and make sure that at every stage in the proceedings, right down to the drafting of the cabinet note, that the country's rules, regulations, and laws were followed. That he asked the Prime Minister to give him, in writing, an explanation as to why the cabinet did what the cabinet did on the 28th of August.
President of the Banking and General Workers Union, Vincent Cabrera, made his position clear.
When I got the invitation from Dr. Rowley, I pondered whether I should come here. And then I said, as I was marching today, I told Dr. Rowley, it's Kamala have me here. Because if they didn't do the nonsense they're doing, I would not have been here.
And so too MSJ leader David Abdullah.
That bad governance was an attack on our democracy. And what the people are demonstrating here today by your thousands is that people power can trump the power of those in office who are corrupt.
Dr. Rowley says he has asked the president to respond in a timely manner, vowing that this is not the end of the beginning, but the beginning of the end for the current regime.
And also speaking on the platform this afternoon was THA Chief Secretary Orville London, who says he is going back home convinced that democracy is alive and well.
I must say that I'm going back to Tobago in a much more comfortable frame of mind than when I left. Because I go back to Tobago with the confidence that democracy is alive and well in Trinidad and Tobago. Because the people of Trinidad and Tobago have taken that decision to take control of the democratic process.
And that's the story which takes us to the Your Vote question tonight. The question we're asking you to vote on is, do you believe the massive turnout at the March Against Injustice is indicative of public disenchantment over the proclamation of Section 34? Text your response to the number 2623. If your response is yes, you're texting the letter Y, and if it's no, the letter N. We'll give you an update on the voting during the newscast and the final vote at the very end tonight. Well, joining us via the telephone now is Communications Minister Jamaluddin Mohammed. Good evening, Minister Mohammed.
Good evening, Charlene. Good evening to your viewers.
Well, thank you for joining us. Now, we wanted to get the government's response to these massive protests this afternoon. Tell us, this time, is the government worried at all about the political fallout from the proclamation?
Not at all. I have to agree with your reporter, Samson Nanton, and THA Secretary Orville London, that democracy is alive and well in Trinidad and Tobago. The people came out today and expressed themselves. Their opinion was well drafted and sent out by the leader of the PNM, and that's democracy in action.
Are you at all concerned about the numbers, though? I mean, quite a large crowd.
No, I'm not concerned in the least bit about the amount of people that were there today. That is their democratic right, and they were allowed to proceed with their march in a very peaceful and organized fashion.
And what about, we're trying to find out now, what is the government's reaction now? Are you all not commenting on the repeal of Section 34? The Prime Minister hasn't said anything about it so far. Is she going to make a statement at all?
The Prime Minister hasn't said anything, but she has acted in a most surgical and decisive manner last week, if you notice what had happened in the Parliament to repeal Section 34 of that Act. And she has done what is supposed to be done at this time.
But are you concerned?
I just want to remind you, Charlene, and your viewers, that this People's Partnership government was elected by a strong mandate of the people. We were given a mandate to rule this country for 5 years. We have every intention of completing that 5-year session, this first term of the People's Partnership government. No march or anything like that is going to serve as an election for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. We have a democratic way of electing our government in this country.
Now, Minister, I mean, you're talking about democracy, but certainly this march has gathered a lot of support in a very short space of time. Are you concerned about the fallout? This march seems to be sort of the genesis of perhaps bigger things to come as a result of the repeal of this particular clause.
Well, let's see how it will play out. Today was an expression of the democracy, and we'll see how it will play out with time itself.
Okay, Minister, thank you so much for joining us there on the telephone. Thank you for giving us the government's response to today's march around the Savannah, which saw Dr. Keith Rowley taking a petition to the President's House with regards to the controversy surrounding the repeal of Section 34 of that Act. Well, moving on to other news now. National Security Minister Jack Warner has condemned the PNM march against the government, saying opposition leader Dr. Keith Rowley has no moral authority to lead any march. He says issues surrounding Section 34 of the Administration of Justice Act 2011 have been fixed and it's time to move on. Chester Sembrano tells us more.
The proclamation of Section 34 of the Indictable Proceedings Act 2011 and the subsequent repeal continues to haunt the government as hundreds came out in a show of support on Tuesday against the government. This show of force did not sit well with National Security Minister Jack Warner, who deemed it useless. Minister Warner going so far as to tell reporters that as far as he is concerned, PNM leader Dr. Keith Rowley had no moral authority to lead a march like this.
You should march the President's house alone. Just go high up, turn left, and go sit down.
Clearly unhappy with the growing public discontent about the issue, Minister Warner says he is at a loss to understand what all the fuss is about, since all the wrongs have already been made right.
All of us heard, all of us overlooked the particular clause, and we have since amended, and for me that's the end of the matter.
Regarding President Richard's comment of the Section 34 debacle, Minister Warner said while he did not want to disrespect the highest office, he is left to wonder about the timing of His Excellency's utterances.
After almost 8 years, when Manning was there, he had no voice. If in the last 6 months he has found his voice, let him do that.
Minister Warner was also critical of the Dean of the Holy Trinity Cathedral, Reverend Colin Sampson, for his comments on the matter at the church service to mark the opening of the law term on Monday.
A piece on the altar takes the house of God and makes it into Bali's house. That is unpardonable.
As the growing public calls for the Prime Minister to address the matter, Mr. Warner says it's unnecessary.
What more can she say? What new can she say? What's the purpose?
I am Chester Sembrano, reporting for CNC3 News.
An apology tonight from the Congress of the People for the controversial proclamation of Section 34 of the Administration of Justice Act. But COP leader Prakash Ramada, who heads the Parliament's Legislative Review Committee, is now questioning whether he can now trust some of his own cabinet colleagues, since he says the legislation the committee brought before Parliament is fundamentally different from what was eventually proclaimed. Kamal Georges attended a news conference this morning and he files a report.
Things are done in an environment of trust, and sometimes, that trust may be not necessarily well-founded.
That question of trust, fueled by what COP political leader Prakash Ramada believes are suspicious actions by some in relation to Section 34 of the Administration of Justice Act. As head of the Legislative Review Committee of Parliament, Mr. Ramada would have been instrumental in preparing the legislation. But as he sought to clarify his involvement in the matter on Tuesday, Minister Ramada said the clause which was eventually proclaimed bore very little resemblance to what was before the LRC and debated in the Parliament.
So I just wanted to make that clarification abundant to all of us so that there will be no misunderstanding that the LRC ever deliberated upon the Section 34 that was ultimately passed by both houses.
So then, who is responsible for the changes to the document between the Parliament and the Senate? Minister Ramada assumed some responsibility for the ensuing imbroglio, but while he refused to point fingers directly, he said the Ministry of Justice was ultimately responsible for the document which was debated in the Senate.
But commitments were made that before the proclamation that things would have to be put into place, so that when the Act came into force, that all the infrastructure would have been in place and the rules and everything there.
Minister Ramada has asked for a meeting with Prime Minister Kamla Persad-Bissessar to discuss the issue. He said he was very concerned about stories in the newspapers about ministers toasting champagne in Tobago with persons accused in the Piarco Airport fraud case. And if there was any deliberate attempt to dupe the population, Minister Ramada says firm action is required. I am Kamal Georges reporting for CNC3 News.